Hello, and welcome to the science portion of the TEAS prep brought to you by the Academic Support Center at Daytona State College. When you take the science section of the TEAS, you will see 53 questions total. Out of those, only 47 questions are scored. You will have a 63-minute time limit, which gives you approximately 1.1 minutes per question, and this is graded using a scaled score. So what is a scaled score? The percentage of questions you get right is irrelevant. The percentage of people who took the same test and got fewer questions right does matter. So it is not how much you know, it is do you know more than everyone else. When you take the TEAS exam, the breakdown of science questions will look like this. The vast majority will be on human anatomy and physiology, including the respiratory, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, neuromuscular, reproductive, integumentary, endocrine, genitourinary, immune, and skeletal systems. There will be 8 questions on life and physical sciences, where you will need to describe the basic macromolecules in a biological system, compare and contrast chromosomes, genes, and DNA, explain Mendel's laws of heredity, recognize basic atomic structure, explain characteristic properties of substances, compare and contrast changes in states of matter, and describe chemical reactions. There will also be 7 questions on scientific reasoning. We need to identify basic scientific measurements using laboratory tools, critique a scientific explanation using logic and evidence, explain relationships among events, objects, and processes, and analyze the design of a scientific investigation.
This is a table of metric prefixes. It ranges from very large units at the top to very small units at the bottom. In the very middle is where you will find your base unit. The base unit is going to be either meters, liters, or grams. The nice thing about the metric system is that measurements for mass, distance, and volume all use the exact same prefixes. Under the multiplier column, it tells us how many base units are in each of these metric prefixes. For example, if we look at mega, it shows us 1 million in the multiplier column. That tells us that there are 1 million meters in a megameter, 1 million liters in a megaliter, or 1 million grams in a megagram. If we want to convert from the metric prefix into the base unit, we would simply multiply by the number in the multiplier column. For instance, if we want to figure out how many grams are in 2,000 centigrams, we look under the multiplier column for centi. It says 0.01, so we would simply multiply 2,000 by 0.01, and we would know that 2,000 centigrams is equal to 20 grams. A unit conversion factor is a ratio of one unit of measurement to another unit of measurement. Anytime you have two things that are equal, you can write them as a fraction. These fractions are sometimes called conversion factors or equivalencies. For this example, we know that 0.01 meters is equal to 1 centimeter. This is from the multiplier column on the previous slide. We can write that as either of the two fractions shown. Which one do we use then? When we are converting, we always want to write the unit we want our answer to be in on the top. Let's try an example. Convert 45 meters into centimeters. We are going to start by writing the given, 45 meters. Now we want to write our conversion factor with the unit we are going to on the top. Therefore, we want to write 1 centimeter on the top and put 0.01 meters on the bottom. Then when we multiply, the meters will cancel and I'll be left in centimeters. For this example, 45 meters, when we multiply by 1 centimeter over 0.01 meters, that gives us the answer of 4,500 centimeters. Exchange of gases occurs in which of the following structures of the respiratory system? So this question requires that you know some basic anatomy about the respiratory system. If we look at letter D, the pleura, that's actually a serous membrane that covers the lungs. So we can rule out D. If we look at letter C, the trachea, well, the trachea is the windpipe. And the windpipe, all it does is it conducts air to the lungs. So we can rule out C as well. If we look at letter B, the bronchioles, well, the bronchioles are small tubes that lead into the alveoli. We can rule out B because gas exchange does not occur in the bronchioles. The correct answer is letter A, the alveoli. The alveoli are the structures in the lungs where gas exchange occurs with the blood. Which of the following composes the rings that support the trachea? So the trachea, that's the windpipe. If you know that ligaments connect bone to bone and tendons connect muscle to bone, since the windpipe isn't a bone, we can rule those out. We're left with spongy bone and hyaline cartilage. Spongy bone, that's where red bone marrow is housed, and that's in our skeletal system. Hyaline cartilage actually composes the rings that support the trachea. Which of the following occurs if the epiglottis does not function properly? So this question only requires that you know what the epiglottis is. The epiglottis is an elastic cartilage flap that covers the trachea or windpipe. Each time you swallow food, the epiglottis comes over the trachea and prevents food from going into the windpipe. So I think letter B best supports that. The client coughs because food goes into the trachea. Through which of the following does blood pass after leaving the right ventricle during contraction of the heart? So this question requires that you know blood flow through the body. Keep in mind that the left side of the heart provides blood to the body, while the right side of the heart supplies blood to the lungs. So the answer should have something to do with the lungs. If we look at A, the aorta, that's an artery leading out of the left ventricle, so we can rule that out. If we look at C, vena cava, that's actually a vein that supplies blood to the right atrium of the heart. We can also rule that out. If we look at D, the mitral valve, that is a valve found in the left side of the heart between the atria and the ventricles, so we can rule that out as well. The answer to this is B, pulmonary artery. After passing through the stomach, food continues into which of the following digestive structures? So food exiting the stomach passes into the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum, and that's letter A. The jejunum, letter B, that's actually the second part of the small intestine, and letter C, the ileum, that's the third part of the small intestine. D, the cecum, that's the first part of the large intestine. Breakdown of which of the following begins in the small intestine. So let's quickly talk about the digestive system and where the breakdown of nutrients occurs. If we look at letter D, carbohydrates, the breakdown of carbohydrates begins in the mouth with an enzyme called salivary amylase. If we look at letter A, protein breakdown actually begins in the stomach, so we can rule out letter A as well. If we look at C, fiber is substance that is not broken down or digested in the body. It passes all the way through the GI, so we can rule out C as well. The answer is B, fats. Fat breakdown begins in the small intestine. Muscular tissue includes all of the following except skeletal muscle, nervous muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. So the three types of muscle in the body are skeletal muscle, which allows you to move, cardiac muscle, which allows your heart to beat, and smooth muscle, which propels food through the GI tract, as well as causes your bronchioles and blood vessels to constrict and dilate. So the answer to this must be B, nervous muscle. Nervous tissue is a different type of tissue. that conducts electrical impulses through the body. Which of the following activities is most likely controlled by the nervous system? So for this question, let's keep in mind that there are two systems in the body that maintain homeostasis or regulate things in the body. And those systems are the nervous system and the endocrine system. So any type of regulation is done by one of those two systems. If we look at letter A, remove heat from the blood, that's actually done by the skin or the integumentary system. If we look at letter C, provide nutrients to various parts of the body, well, that's done by the cardiovascular system and our blood vessels. If we look at letter D, control muscle growth, that is something that's being regulated in the body. However, that's regulated by the endocrine system. It's regulated by hormones, so we can rule out letter D as well. Letter B is the correct answer, regulate blood pressure. That's actually done by the nervous system. Which of the following nervous systems directs the skeletal muscles to respond in the body's fight or flight response? So let's look at letter A, the enteric nervous system. That's actually the nervous system involved in digestion. So we can rule out letter A. Letter B, the central nervous system. The central nervous system is simply the brain and spinal cord. So we can rule out letter B. Letter C, the parasympathetic nervous system. This division of the autonomic nervous system is also called the rest and digest system. It causes the body to slow down and allows you to digest your food. We can rule out letter C, parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system, letter D, that is the nervous system responsible for the body's fight or flight response. Both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are part of the autonomic nervous system, but they have opposite effects. The parasympathetic nervous system slows the body down, and it's called rest and digest, and the sympathetic nervous system speeds the body up, and therefore it's called fight or flight. Which of the following structures is responsible for egg production? So this question requires that we know a little bit about female reproductive anatomy. If we look at letter A, the vagina, that's simply a reproductive structure in the female that allows for sexual intercourse. So we can rule out letter A. B, the fallopian tubes, that's a passageway that leads from the ovaries where the eggs travel to be eventually implanted in the uterus. So we can rule out letter B. Letter D, the uterus, that's where implantation occurs of a zygote, and that's where the baby develops, the fetus. So we can rule out letter D. Letter C, the ovaries, is the correct answer. Keep in mind that ova means eggs, and the ovaries are where eggs are produced in the female. The reproductive system works with other organ systems by, so this question is a little bit tough. Let's see if we can rule out some of the answers. First, let's look at letter C, controlling the pituitary gland. Pituitary control is actually controlled by the hypothalamus of the brain, so we can rule out letter C. Letter D says removing some waste from the lymphatic system. Well, the lymph nodes actually filter the lymphatic vessels. And then what the lymph nodes don't filter, the lymphatic system dumps back into the cardiovascular system, and that's filtered by the kidneys. So we can remove letter D. For this question, I believe the best answer is A, influencing bone growth and form. Think about the skeletal differences between males and females, and it's their hormones that control these differences, such as females have a much wider pelvis. Letter B, could possibly have been the answer, except it says releasing hormones that influence muscle strength. So the hormone testosterone affects muscle size and growth. However, I believe letter A is a better answer. Which of the following integumentary structures produces sweat? So let's go over these different integumentary structures and talk about what each produces. Letter A, the sudoriferous glands, those produce sweat in the skin. Letter B, the sebaceous glands, those produce oil or sebum in the skin. Letter C, the ceruminous glands, those actually produce earwax. And letter D, the mammary glands, those produce milk. We can rule out letters B, C, and D. So the correct answer is A, sudoriferous glands. The adrenal glands are part of the empathic system, endocrine system, immune system, or respiratory system. So what should give this question away is that you see gland in the question. The endocrine system is actually the system in the body that is made up of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. The correct answer would be B, endocrine system. The adrenal glands actually produce adrenaline or norepinephrine. The pancreas is a component of which of the following systems? So the main function of the pancreas is actually to produce digestive enzymes. 99% of the pancreatic cells produce digestive enzymes. However, we don't see digestive system in any of the answer choices. The other 1% of the pancreatic cells actually produce two hormones, one of which is insulin, which lowers blood sugar, and the other is glucagon, which raises blood sugar. Hormones, as we know, belong to the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system of glands that produces hormones. So the correct answer here is C, endocrine. Which of the following endocrine organs produces insulin? So in the previous question, we talked about the pancreas and its role in the endocrine system. The pancreas produces insulin and glucagon. So the correct answer is D, pancreas. The other answer choices, A, the thyroid. The thyroid actually produces hormones T3 and T4 and calcitonin. B, the pituitary. The pituitary produces many hormones that regulate homeostasis in the body. And C, the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland produces adrenaline or epinephrine, as well as other steroid hormones. So A, B, and C can be ruled out. The correct answer is D. Which of the following structures stores urine before excretion? This question requires that we know a little bit about urinary anatomy. Letter A, the kidneys, that's actually where urine is formed in the body. Letter B, the ureters, those are the tubes that lead from the kidneys into the urinary bladder. Letter C, the urinary bladder, that's actually where urine is stored before it's excreted. And letter D, the urethra, that's the passageway that leads from the urinary bladder out of the body. So the correct answer here is C, bladder. Which of the following is the region of the kidney that contains the glomerulus of the nephron? So let's look at some of these options. We can rule out letter D from the beginning. The adrenal gland actually sits on top of the kidney, but it isn't part of the kidney. Let's look at letter B, the renal pelvis. This is the area in the center of the kidney where urine is collected, so we can rule that out. we're looking for the region that contains the glomerulus of the nephron. So we're left with C, cortex, and A, medulla. The medulla is actually the middle of the kidney, and that contains the loops of Henle and the collecting ducts. But it doesn't contain the glomerular capsule or the glomerulus. The glomerulus is actually located in the renal cortex, letter C. Which of the following parts of the adult body makes white blood cells? So both red and white blood cells are created in the red bone marrow. That's letter B, bone marrow. However, some of the white blood cells mature in the thymus, and that's why they gave you thymus as an option, although it's not the correct answer. And the liver and the adenoid glands both do not produce red or white blood cells. The spleen and thoracic duct are part of which of the following systems? So we should know that the spleen is actually the largest organ in the lymphatic system. So that would be the correct answer, letter C. Remember that letter A, endocrine system, that's a series of glands. And since we don't see gland in the question, that's probably not the answer. We can also rule out letter B, reproductive, and letter D, urinary. Which group of major parts and organs make up the immune system? So as I mentioned in the previous question, the spleen is the largest organ in the lymphatic system. But lymphatic and immune system are often used interchangeably. So you can think of the spleen as also belonging to the immune system. If we look at letter A, it says lymphatic system, spleen, tonsils, thymus, and bone marrow. That is the correct answer. Letter B, brain, spinal cord, and nerve cells. Those are part of the nervous system. Letter C, heart, veins, arteries, and capillaries. Those are part of the cardiovascular system. And letter D, nose, trachea, bronchial tubes, lungs, alveolus, and diaphragm. Those are all part of the respiratory system. Which of the following bones supports the tongue and is the only bone in the body not anchored to other bones? Let's try to rule some of these out. Letter A, the patella, that's actually your kneecap, so letter A is not the answer. Letter B, the coccyx, that's your tailbone, so letter B is not the answer. And letter D, scapula, that's your shoulder blade, so letter D is not the answer. The correct answer is letter C, hyoid. Remember that the hyoid is the only bone in the body not anchored to other bones.
Which of the following statements correctly compares prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells? If we remember that pro means before and eu means true, it can help us remember that eukaryotes are more complex than prokaryotes. In this case, answers B, C, and D are incorrect. A is the correct answer because prokaryotes do not contain organelles and eukaryotic cells do. These organelles include the nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, and others. When does the nuclear division of somatic cells take place during cellular reproduction? Let's break this question down a little bit. Although nuclear division occurs in both meiosis and mitosis, the key word here is somatic. And somatic cells are any cell of a living organism other than the reproductive cells, so we know it can't be B, meiosis. It also cannot be A, because interphase is the time of cell growth in DNA replication. And cytokinesis, answer C, is the division of the cytoplasm. So the correct answer is D, mitosis. Which of the following is needed for cellular waste recycling? We can rule out A, centrosome, because that's involved in cellular reproduction. We can rule out C, because our chromosomes contain our DNA. We can rule out D, because the Golgi apparatus packages protein. The correct answer is B, lysosome. What is the role of ribosomes? We know the answers cannot be B, C, or D, because we learned in the previous question that waste removal is done in the lysosomes. Transport is done through the endoplasmic reticulum, and storage is done by vacuoles. So the answer is A, make proteins, because ribosomes are involved in protein synthesis. What is the longest phase of the cell cycle? The answer is C, interphase. This is also known as the growth phase. This is the stage during which all of the preparation for cell division takes place. If a cell is placed in a hypertonic solution, what will happen to the cell? The answer is B, it will shrink. And this is because water moves from a higher concentration inside the cell to a lower concentration outside. Which of the following correctly lists the cellular hierarchy from the simplest to the most complex structure? First, we have to know what the simplest structure is, which is the cell. Option B is the only option here that begins with cell. From there, cells build tissues, which form organs systems, which are all contained inside the organism. So B is our only viable option. What are groups of cells that perform the same function called? We can pretty quickly rule out answers B and C, because molecules are atoms coming together and not living things, and plastids are pieces of DNA. If we think back to our previous question, we know that tissue comes after cell in the hierarchy of structure. We can't skip over this and go directly to organs, because organs are tissues that are working together. So the answer is A, tissues. Which of the following is an example of a tissue? We can rule out answers A, B, and C because these are more complex than tissue. We are looking at organs or organisms. The correct answer is D, xylem, because this is vascular tissue found in a plant. Which of the following byproducts of cellular respiration is used by autotrophs in the production of glucose? First, we need to know what an autotroph is. An autotroph is an organism that is self-feeding or self-nourishing, such as plants. And we know that plants take in carbon dioxide to help with the production of glucose. Therefore, the answer is B, carbon dioxide. Which of the following is the term given to multiple forms of a gene that are produced by mutation? We can rule out A and D, adaptation and natural selection, as these are types of evolution. We can also rule out B, DNA, because this is what genes are stored in. The correct answer is C, allele. An allele is a form of a gene. Nucleotides are to DNA as amino acids are to proteins. This is because nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA and amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Which of the following describes how a Punnett square can help predict the genotype of the offspring if the alleles of both parents are known? A Punnett square simply shows you what genotypes are possible in the offspring, so the correct answer is B. Which word describes the allele for green eyes? We can rule out answers B and C, homozygous and heterozygous, because those are referring to pairs of alleles, where in this question we are just looking at a singular allele, which leaves us with answers A or D. So if we look at our key, we can see that lowercase g is the allele for green eyes, which means that it is a recessive gene. So the answer is D. What is the possibility that the offspring produced will have brown eyes? Uppercase letters denote dominant genes and lowercase letters denote recessive genes. If we look at our Punnett square, we can see that there is an uppercase B denoting brown eyes, which is present in 3 out of the 4 squares, which means that there is a 75% possibility that the offspring produced will have brown eyes. So the correct answer is B, 75%.
A substance with a pH of 7 when dissolved in water is either A, a strong acid, B, a weak base, C, a neutral salt, or D, a weak acid. This question requires that we know a little bit about the pH scale. So on the pH scale, it ranges from 0 to 14 with 7 in the middle. Something with a pH of 7 means that it's neutral. Anything with a pH under 7 means that it's acidic, with the most acidic things having a pH of 1 or even less. And things with a pH of greater than 7 are considered basic or alkaline. Since this question is asking us a substance with a pH of 7, we can rule out that substance being either an acid or a base, since it falls right in the middle of the pH scale. So the correct answer here would be letter C, a neutral salt. An unknown element is found to contain 45 protons and an atomic mass of 64. What is its atomic number? So for this question, it requires that we know a little bit about the periodic table and what atomic number and atomic mass are. Atomic number is actually the number of protons that an element has. So in this question, this element has 45 protons, therefore its atomic number is also 45. The answer is C. They did give us a bit of extraneous information that we don't need. They told us the atomic mass is 64. The atomic mass is actually the sum of the protons and neutrons. But we don't need that information to answer this question. Water undergoes relatively minor temperature and phase changes compared to other substances due to both its. So a few things to understand about water and why it works so well in biological systems is that water has a very high specific heat and a high heat of vaporization. What high specific heat means is that it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water. If you think about boiling water on the stove, it takes a very long time for the water inside of the pot to get up to temperature. However, the metal that the pot is made of, that gets up to temperature rather quickly, and that's because metal has a very low specific heat. High heat of vaporization of water is due to hydrogen bonding in water. It's very difficult to rip those molecules apart into a gas. The correct answer in this case would be letter D, high specific heat and high heat of vaporization. One group of chemical elements referred to as a family has gram atomic weights of approximately 19, 35.5, 79.9, and 126.9. If one of these elements is a solid at room temperature, its gram atomic weight must be. So for this question, they're telling you that these elements are all in the same family on the periodic table, which means they're in the same column. There are some trends in the periodic table that elements in the same column tend to behave the same. Typically, elements that are lighter, for example, this one that weighs 19, is more likely to be a gas at room temperature. And as you go down the periodic table and the element becomes heavier, then it's more likely to be a solid at room temperature. So you can rule out 19 because it's the lightest, and because you don't know much about these elements, Your choice must be the heaviest of the four, which is 126.9, letter D. Which of the answer choices provided best defines the following statement? For a given mass and constant temperature, an inverse relationship exists between the volume and pressure of a gas. You would come across this relationship in your Anatomy and Physiology 2 class, specifically in the respiratory chapter. This is where they mention Boyle's law, which states that there's an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. Therefore, if the volume of a chamber that a gas occupies goes up, then the pressure will go down, and vice versa. If the volume goes down, then the pressure will go up. The rate of a chemical reaction depends on all of the following except A, presence of catalysts, B, temperature, C, surface area, or D, amount of mass lost. So let's look at A, presence of catalysts. Catalysts are things that speed up chemical reactions. So the rate of a chemical reaction definitely depends on the presence of catalysts. So we can rule out letter A. Letter B, temperature. The hotter something is, the faster it will react chemically. So the rate of a chemical reaction does depend on temperature. So we can rule out letter B. C, surface area. The rate of a chemical reaction is definitely dependent on surface area. The more surface area the chemicals have to interact with one another, the faster the rate of reaction will go. So we can also rule out letter C. Letter D must be the answer, the amount of mass lost. There is a law called the law of conservation of matter, and that states that matter cannot be created or destroyed during a chemical reaction. Which of the following is exchanged between two or more atoms that undergo ionic bonding? So with all types of bonding, chemicals are either exchanging or sharing their electrons. Electrons are the negatively charged particles that orbit the nucleus, and they're organized into shells. The outermost shell is called the valence shell and contains valence electrons. And it's that outermost shell that's interacting with other chemicals to bond. So the correct answer for this would be C, valence electrons. Which of the following formulas best summarizes a single replacement reaction? So all four of these answer choices are important to know for the TEAS exam, so we're going to go over all four of them. Letter A says A plus B is equal to AB. Here on the left side of the equation, you're starting with two separate chemicals, and then you can see on the right side of the equation they've been combined. This is an example of a combination reaction, which is sometimes also referred to as a synthesis reaction. So letter A is not the correct choice. Let's look at letter D for a second. That says AB is equal to A plus B. This is the opposite of what we saw for letter A. Here we're starting with a substance and then it's being broken down from the left side to the right. This is actually an example of a decomposition reaction. So now let's look at letter B. AB plus C is equal to AC plus B. This is actually an example of a single replacement reaction. Notice the C, which was by itself on the left side, took the place of the letter B and is now paired with A on the right side of the equation. B is the correct option. However, letter C, which says AB plus CD is equal to AD plus CB, this is actually an example of a double replacement reaction because they swapped partners and two replacements occurred from the left side to the right side. Which of the following correctly balances the combustion reaction above? So for this question, it's difficult for me to demonstrate how to balance an equation, but one way we could approach this problem is to count the number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms on each side, the left and the right side, for the answers and see if they match. In addition, we have to have the same substances. So on the top we have a CH4, an O2, a CO2, and an H2O. Our answer needs to have all four of those substances. Right away we can rule out letter B because B has a CO on the right side of the equation while they have a CO2 on the right side of the equation. So B can't be the answer. Let's look at some of the other choices. So for letter A, we have one carbon on the left and one carbon on the right. We have 4 hydrogen atoms on the left, but we only have 2 on the right. So A also can't be the answer. Let's look at letter C. C has 1 carbon on the left and 1 carbon on the right. That's correct. It also has 4 hydrogen atoms on the left, and it has 2 times 2, which is 4 hydrogen atoms on the right. And letter C has 2 oxygen atoms on the left, but it has 4 oxygen atoms on the right. So C can't be the correct answer. Let's look at letter D. Letter D has 1 carbon on the left, 1 carbon on the right. That's good. It has 4 hydrogen atoms on the left. It has 4 hydrogen atoms on the right. That's good. And it has 4 oxygen atoms on the left and 2 oxygen from the CO2 and 2 from the H2O. It also has 4 oxygen atoms on the right. So D must be the correct answer. When an automobile traveling at 60 miles per hour is brought to a rapid stop, the 2 types of energy most involved are. So let's discuss the different types of energy. I'm sure you've always heard growing up, potential energy, that's energy at rest, and kinetic energy is energy in motion. Since this automobile is traveling at 60 miles per hour, I don't think that potential energy is necessarily going to be involved here. So we can rule out A and B. So we're left with kinetic and chemical energy or kinetic and heat energy. Since this doesn't involve chemicals, I think we can also rule out letter C, kinetic and chemical. The 2 types of energy most involved are kinetic energy, which is energy in motion, and heat energy, which is the energy due to friction of the tires stopping.
In this question, we are going to look at scientific reasoning and following logic. Robert Koch, a German physician, helped to establish the germ theory of infectious disease by a chain of postulates that bear his name. The postulates demonstrated that a specific pathogen was capable of generating disease in a human host. Koch's postulates entailed 1. Recovering a suspected pathogen from a diseased host, 2. Then growing the pathogen on a culture medium, then 3. Isolating that pathogen, 4. Establishing the pathogen's identity. If we look at our options, option B would be the most logical next step, to inject the isolated pathogen into a healthy host and then monitor for signs of symptoms and disease. This question looks at best experimental protocol when using aspirin to treat a fever. If we look at our answers, we know that we need a larger sample size than 1. So A cannot be our answer because we are only treating 1 patient with aspirin. If we look at answers C and D, the time frame seems a little funny. We have all taken aspirin before, and in option C, we know within 5 minutes it's not very effective yet. And in option D, after 24 hours, it has already worn off. So the correct answer is B, to treat 6 patients with 602 milligram aspirin and to take their temperature every hour for 6 hours. Which of the following is considered least useful in conducting quantitative scientific research? First of all, we need to know the difference between quantitative and qualitative datum. Qualitative data are anything that can be expressed as a number or quantified, whereas qualitative observations can be observed but not measured. So when we're looking at conducting quantitative scientific research, answers A, B, and C, modeling data, applying empirical formulas, and using highly precise measurement tools are very useful. Option D, recording qualitative observations, is the least useful. So D is our answer. This question is looking at inferring an answer. When you're inferring an answer, you're coming to a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning. So here, the question is asking, a student is testing the materials in 2 different soil samples. Which of the following assumptions can be inferred from the data presented in the table? We have option B, which says sample 1 is the best soil, which is completely subjective, so we know B cannot be the answer. C, nitrates are more frequently found in soil than are phosphates, which for this sample may seem to be true, but we only are looking at 2 samples. That is not a large enough sample size to infer an answer. And option D, most plants thrive in nitrate-rich soil, is not correct because we are not looking at any sort of plants here, just soil samples. So answer A, different soils contain different nutrients, is an assumption that can be inferred from the data that we are presented with. So A is our answer. In a medication study, population A is given the medication and population B is given a placebo. Which of the following describes population B? The correct answer is A, the control group, because there is no change happening to population B. A student measures 2,000 milliliters of water into a cylinder. If water has a mass of 1 gram per milliliter, which of the following is the approximate mass of the water? So first thing we have to do is get rid of our milliliters by dividing. So you would divide 2,000 milliliters by 1 gram per milliliter, so you're just left with 2,000 grams. And now all we have to do is convert. So answers A, B, and C are incorrect if we look at our conversion chart. Answer D, 20 hectograms, is the only accurate answer. So D is our answer. Which is an example of deductive reasoning? First of all, what is deductive reasoning? It's the process of drawing a conclusion based on premises that are generally assumed to be true. So if we look at our options here, option A states only 21% of a town's population have expressed a desire to ban all cars. Therefore, the new proposition banning cars in the state is not likely to pass. We do not look at future stuff when we're doing deductive reasoning, so A cannot be our answer. B, people who brush their teeth regularly have fewer instances of heart disease, therefore good dentistry can prevent heart attacks. These two have a big gap in reasoning here. Teeth brushing and heart disease don't generally get associated with each other. C, all soccer players who play professionally can kick well. Therefore, any future soccer player who is recruited to play professionally will be able to kick well. Again, we don't look at future instances. And last but not least, option D, all secretaries are good typists. Cynthia is a secretary, therefore she is a good typist. Option D is a good example of deductive reasoning.
The spleen functions are part of the blank system. So this question just requires that you know which system the spleen belongs to. The spleen is the largest organ in the lymphatic system, and it acts as a filter for the blood. So B would be the correct answer, lymphatic. Which of the following is a possible cause of herniated discs? So what a herniated disc is between each of your vertebrae, you have fibrocartilage. Those are called intervertebral discs. Well, those discs have a soft inside and a fibrous exterior. And when that soft inside leaks out through the outer portion of the disc, that's a herniated disc. And it can either happen over a long period of time or because of some trauma. So which of these answers best suggests some type of trauma? I would probably say letter B, whiplash. That's the correct answer. Which of the following is a characteristic of the autonomic nervous system? So let's look at some of these answers and see if we can rule some of them out. So letter A says, it regulates the voluntary control of the body movements through the skeletal muscles. Well, the nervous system involved with skeletal muscles is called the somatic nervous system. So letter A is not the correct answer. Letter B says, it is part of the nervous system consisting of the brain and spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord actually make up the central nervous system. So letter B is also not the answer. Letter C says, it regulates involuntary activity in the heart, stomach, lungs, and intestines. Letter C is the correct answer. It is the autonomic nervous system that regulates involuntary activity of the body. And let's look at D just to check. It says, it is thought to be the center of intelligence. That would most likely be in the brain, which is once again part of the central nervous system. During photosynthesis, which two compounds are combined to create the output of glucose and oxygen? So going into the TEAS exam, I would strongly recommend that you memorize the process of photosynthesis. That's the process where plants take carbon dioxide and water along with sunlight and turn those things into glucose, which is food, and oxygen. So which two things are combined to create glucose and oxygen? The correct answer would be A, carbon dioxide and water. What type of bond between the complementary bases of DNA stabilizes the double helix structure? So a few things to know about DNA. It's arranged in a double helix, and in that double helix you have 4 bases. They are A, T, C, and G. A always pairs with T, and C always pairs with G. That's what this question is referring to as complementary bases. The reason for these base pairings is hydrogen bonding, letter C. Which of the following subatomic particles are found inside of an atom's nucleus? So this requires that we know a little bit about how atoms are arranged. There are 3 types of subatomic particles. There are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are found inside of the center of the atom, which is called the nucleus. And electrons orbit the nucleus. So the correct answer is B, neutrons and protons.
Which of the following statements is true regarding trophic levels? First of all, what is a trophic level? It's a group of organisms within an ecosystem that occupy the same level in a food chain. We always start with plants as they are producers because they can create their own energy. So if we move up the chain, we then have primary consumers, which eat the plants. We have secondary consumers, which eat those animals. And then we have tertiary consumers, which eat the secondary consumers. As you move up these chains, only about 10% of energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to the next. The rest is lost as heat energy. So if we look at our answer options, we have option A, which is tertiary consumers acquire more energy content than secondary consumers. We now know that that's not true because as you move up the levels, you're losing energy. B, producers acquire less energy than primary consumers. Again, not true because producers acquire the most energy from the sun. C, secondary consumers acquire more energy than primary consumers. Also not true as we're moving up. And then D, tertiary consumers acquire less energy than primary consumers. That one is true because primary consumers get a lot of energy, whereas tertiary consumers have lost a lot of that energy.
Why does the human eye perceive a red-colored dress as the color red? So the way light works is an object absorbs certain wavelengths of light. And all of those wavelengths that are absorbed by the object, we cannot see. We can only see the light that's reflected by the object. So the reason a red-colored dress appears red is because the dress is reflecting red light and it's not absorbing red light. So the correct answer would be A. The molecules of the dress do not absorb red light wavelengths.
In a lab experiment designed to test the rate at which plants grow under artificial light, the kind of light used is which type of variable? In an experiment, an independent variable is a factor controlled by the scientists. A dependent variable represents the output or effect. Since the light is controlled by the experimenters, it is an independent variable. So B, independent, is our answer.
Which organ system is primarily responsible for regulating metabolism, mood, and growth? So there's a few different ways you could approach this question. The way I thought of it was, well, in order to regulate growth, you have to target many different tissues in the body. Metabolism as well. It's not just one tissue that needs to grow, it's all of them, so the bones and the muscles. And how is it possible for a system to target many tissues? Well, they could do that by secreting some type of a hormone that travels through the blood. So I believe the correct answer is B, the endocrine system. The endocrine system regulates metabolism by secreting T3 and T4 from the thyroid, and it regulates growth by secreting growth hormone from the pituitary gland. In a vacuum, why doesn't an elephant accelerate faster than a penny as it falls to the ground? So on Earth, gravity pulls everything down at the same acceleration. That acceleration is 9.8 meters per second squared. The reason some objects, such as a feather, fall slower than others is because of air resistance. But since this is taking place in a vacuum, which is a chamber where all the air has been sucked out, there should be no air resistance. Therefore, the correct answer is C. They both have an acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared. Which train described below would have the greatest momentum? So in order to answer this question, you would need to know that the momentum of an object is equal to the mass of the object times the velocity of the object. For all of these answers, we're given a mass and a velocity. So what you would need to do is you would need to multiply the masses by the velocities for each separate answer and see which one gave you the largest value. If you did that, you would see that a 9,500 kilogram train car moving at 200 miles per hour has the greatest momentum. So the correct answer is A. A scientist found that when an invasive species was introduced into a river, the population of salmon native to the region decreased. The type of correlation between these two populations could be described as what? So in this case, we are introducing an invasive species, so we're putting more of them into the river. If this were a direct correlation, when we put this invasive species into the river, then the salmon native to the region would actually increase. A direct correlation, when you increase one thing, the other thing goes up. In this case, we are increasing the invasive species in the river. However, the population of salmon is decreasing. So one thing goes up, the other goes down. That's an example of an inverse correlation. Letter B. The addition of a catalyst to chemical reaction will have what effect? So a catalyst is something that decreases the amount of energy it takes to start a reaction. And by decreasing the amount of energy it takes to start a reaction, you increase the speed of the reaction, or increase the rate at which the reaction takes place. Letter A says increase the energy required, and that's not true because catalysts have that opposite effect. So letter A cannot be the answer. Letter B said increase the time required for the reaction to take place, and that also isn't true because a catalyst would decrease the amount of time required. Letter D says reduce the amount of products in the reaction, and that also is not true. A catalyst would increase the amount of products in the reaction. The correct answer here is C, increase the rate at which the reaction takes place. The pharynx is part of what body system? So the common name for the pharynx is actually the throat. And the throat is used by both the respiratory systems for air as well as the digestive system for food. So the correct answer here would be A, the respiratory system.
Which of the following is true about eukaryotic cells? Unlike prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells contain mitochondria, a nucleus, lysosomes, and multiple chromosomes. So therefore, D is our correct answer.
What characteristic of an element determines its specific isotope? So isotopes are different versions of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons. For instance, all carbon has 12 protons, but about 97% of carbon has 12 neutrons, while maybe 2% of carbon has 13 neutrons. These are examples of different isotopes of carbon. The correct answer here would be B, the number of neutrons. What is not true about RNA? So let's look through the answer choices and see if we can rule some of them out. Letter A says it contains a sugar called ribose. This is a fact. It does contain a sugar called ribose. That's actually what the R stands for in RNA. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. So letter A cannot be the answer. Letter B says thymine is not one of its base pairings. So RNA has 4 base pairings. They are A, U, C, and G. T is not one of those base pairings. So this is a true statement, and letter B cannot be the answer. So you're left with C and D. It is unstable in alkaline conditions, or D, its sugar is more reduced than DNA's sugar. Letter D is actually also a true statement. Its sugar is more reduced than DNA's sugar. DNA stands for deoxyribo, which is a more reduced form of ribonucleic acid. Therefore, C must be the answer. It is unstable in alkaline conditions. That is not a true statement.
Which of the scenarios would not give a normal distribution? So what is a normal distribution? A normal distribution has most of its data in the center and tapers off on both sides, giving you that nice bell shape. So if we look at our answers, option A, a distribution of the yearly income of families in the US, should give us a pretty decent bell curve. The distribution of heights in a large sample of people should also give us a nice bell curve. Option D, a curve with 97% of the population within the first 2 standard deviations, is the technical definition of a bell curve. If we look at option C and look at the percentage of toxic wastes and pollution in the atmosphere versus the lifespan of organisms in that location, we're looking at an inverse relationship. The more toxins, the shorter the lifespan. So option C would be an example that is not a normal distribution. In a cell, the Golgi apparatus is found in what location? It's definitely not found inside the nucleus, the mitochondria, or the cell wall, which leaves the cytoplasm. The correct answer is D. The Golgi apparatus is found in the cytoplasm. Which taxonomy rank is next smallest after order? If we remember our taxonomy mnemonic device, King Philip came over for good spaghetti, and it goes from largest to smallest. We know that after order comes family. So the correct answer is B, family. In plants, blank involves the formation of a blank. Option A is cytokinesis forms a cleavage furrow, which is true, but we are in animal cells, but we are looking at plant cells, so it is not A. B, telophase involves the formation of a cell plate. That is not true. D, prophase involves the formation of DNA, which is absolutely not true. So we're left with C, cytokinesis involves the formation of a cell plate, which is true. So our answer is C. In plants, cytokinesis involves the formation of a cell plate. Which base is not found in DNA? If we remember our base pairings of CG and TA in DNA, we can rule out everything except for uracil, which is found in RNA. So C, uracil, is the base that is not found in DNA.
Which of the following layers of the atmosphere is the closest to space? So the layer of atmosphere that's actually closest to the Earth is the troposphere. Then comes the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and then the thermosphere. So the thermosphere is actually the layer of the atmosphere that's the closest to space. D. Which is not one of the 4 basic types of tissue? So the 4 basic types of tissue in the body are muscular tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. The correct answer here would be A, parenchyma. Parenchyma is not one of the 4 basic types of tissue. The stomach is blank to the small intestine. So if you were going to describe this using common words, you would probably say the stomach is above the small intestine. Which of the letter choices best represents above? Letter A, lateral. Lateral means away from the midline, so that's not the correct answer. Letter C, posterior. Posterior means behind, so that's also not the correct answer. And letter D, proximal. Proximal means closer to the point of origin, so that's also not the correct answer. The correct answer in this case is B, superior, which means above. The stomach is superior to the small intestine. Which of the following is the atomic mass of an atom containing 42 protons, 42 electrons, and 37 neutrons? So the atomic mass is actually found by adding the protons and the neutrons together. So in this case, we have 42 protons and 37 neutrons. When we add them together, we get 79, which is letter choice B. A patient who has suffered head trauma is not able to recognize people he has met around an hour earlier, but is still able to recognize people he met before the injury. He most likely has damage to what? Let's talk about these different body parts and what they do. So the medulla oblongata actually regulates involuntary controls of the body, such as respiration and heart rate. It doesn't seem like he has damage to the medulla oblongata, so we can rule out letter A. Letter B, corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is involved in connections between the 2 lobes of the brain. he probably also doesn't have damage to his corpus callosum. Letter C, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved in memory storage. It looks like this patient probably suffered some memory loss and has damage to the hippocampus. Of the following, which is not a type of chemical bond? So the bonds that you should be familiar with going into the TEAS exam are ionic bonds and covalent bonds. Ionic bonds happen when one atom donates electrons to another atom. Covalent bonds are when two atoms share electrons. This can be either polar covalent or non-polar covalent. It's a polar covalent bond if one of those atoms that's sharing the electrons wants the electrons more than the other atom. It's non-polar covalent if they both want the electrons the same. The type of bond that is not a chemical bond on this list is D, magnetic bond. If the amount of hydrogen in a balloon of fixed size is doubled, what happens to the mass and density of the balloon? So we have a balloon that cannot increase in size, let's say, and we're going to put more hydrogen into that balloon. Certainly the mass will increase because we're adding substance to the balloon. Density is simply mass divided by volume. Our mass is increasing, but our volume cannot increase because the balloon size is fixed. Therefore, density will also increase. The correct answer here is D, the mass and density both increase. If you have 200 milliliters of a 60% sodium chloride solution, how much sodium chloride is dissolved in the solution? So, the way you can find 60% of 200 is first you need to convert the percentage to a decimal by dividing by 100. When you do this, that will give you 0.60. Then you multiply the two together. So 0.60 times 200 gives you 120. The correct answer is D, 120 grams. A scientist wants to write an equation using the variables x, y, and z. What is the proper relationship between the variables if x represents time, y represents energy, and z represents power? So in order to answer this question, you would need to know that power is equal to energy divided by time. Then just plug in the letters for what they represent, and you should end up with letter D. Z is equal to y over x. What type of cells result from mitosis? So first it's important to understand the difference between haploid and diploid. Diploid are cells that contain all of the genetic information that they need. All of our body cells are diploid. The only cells in our body that are not diploid are our sex cells, which is either sperm or egg. The sperm or egg only contain half of the genetic material to make a human. That's why fertilization must take place for them to combine and form a zygote, which is a diploid cell. All of our body cells, when they divide, they produce two identical copies of themselves. And since these cells are identical to diploid cells, that results in two diploid cells. The answer is C. If this question were asking what type of cells result from meiosis, then the answer would be D, for haploid cells. The presence of which hormone would not cause an increase in water retention? So for this question, it's important to understand that we have many hormones in our body that increase our blood pressure and very few hormones that decrease our blood pressure. Blood pressure and water volume in the body are the same. So if you increase the volume of liquid in the body, then you increase blood pressure. The only hormone that doesn't increase blood pressure in our body and actually decreases it is B, ANP, which stands for atrial natriuretic peptide. Otherwise, all these other hormones, renin, angiotensin, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone, they all increase water retention and therefore also increase blood pressure. Which of the following hormones are secreted directly by the hypothalamus? So let's look at some of these choices and try to rule some of them out. Letter A says melatonin. Melatonin is actually secreted by the pineal gland, which is in the epithalamus. So letter A is not the answer. Letter B says oxytocin. Oxytocin, while it is produced in the hypothalamus, it's actually released by the posterior pituitary gland. So letter B is not the answer. Letter D says calcitonin. Calcitonin regulates blood calcium in the body, and it's actually secreted by the thyroid gland. This was a tough question, as most teachers don't explain dopamine as being released by the hypothalamus. Instead, they refer to dopamine in this case as prolactin inhibiting hormone. However, letter C is the correct answer, dopamine.
Which of the following is true about the frog? So if we look at our key, we can see that the circle represents vertebrates, the triangle represents amphibians, and the rectangle represents the family Salamandriae. If we look at our answer options, we can see that it is not a member of the Salamandriae family. C, it is a non-vertebrate. That's not true because it's within the circle. D, it is closer to most tetrapods than to most newts, which is not true also because it's one step away from either of those. So B, it is a type of amphibian, is our correct answer. What would this diagram be useful for? If we look at our diagram, we can see that it follows the outcomes for potential infection all the way from exposure to transmission. Options B, C, and D are inaccurate. We cannot diagnose an infectious disease, control the spread of disease in undeveloped countries, or train nurses to detect early onset symptoms of disease just based off of this diagram. So our answer is A. This diagram will be most useful for determining outcomes for potential infection. What process is illustrated in the diagram below? If we look at this diagram, we can see that there are two different cell divisions going on. And if we see two cell divisions, we know that it has to be meiosis, because mitosis only goes through one cell division. So our answer is A, meiosis.
How many carbon dioxide molecules are required to balance the equation? So in order to balance this equation, we need to count the number of carbons on the left-hand side so we know what number to put in front of CO2 on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, we have 4 molecules of glucose, which is C6H12O6. Each of those 4 molecules has 6 carbons in them. So to find how many carbons, you just need to multiply 4 times 6. That gives you 24. And so when we look on the right-hand side, we need to put a 24 in front of CO2 to give us 24 carbons on the right-hand side as well. Therefore, D is the correct answer, 24.
The graph below records the death rate of 2 types of male flies a certain number of days after a chemical pesticide is sprayed. What is the probability a male Methuselah fly will be alive after 75 days after exposure to the pesticide? If you look at the x-axis, 75 days corresponds to roughly 20% on the y-axis. Since about 20% of the Methuselah flies survive after 75 days, the probability of one fly's survival is 1/5. Our answer is D, 1/5.
What type of correlation is present between price and quality? So on this graph, we're trying to figure out if we were to draw a trend line through this data, would the trend line be positively sloped or negatively sloped? We can rule out letters A and C right away because those say a strong direct or strong indirect correlation. And this data isn't very tightly grouped together. It's kind of sparse. So let's rule those out. And if we drew a trend line through this data, it would probably slope from the bottom left to the top right. However, since the data isn't tightly grouped, the correct answer would be letter B, a weak direct correlation.
The square below is based on the eye color of two parents, one of whom has brown eyes, denoted by capital A, and carries the recessive gene for green eyes, denoted by lowercase a. What is the probability that a biological child of these parents will have brown eyes? If we look at our Punnett square, we can see that 2 out of the 4 squares have an uppercase A, which is the gene for brown eyes. So our answer is C, 50%.
Which of the following terms do these diagrams not portray? So let's look at these diagrams one at a time and see what they're trying to tell us. This first diagram shows some molecule going through a channel of some sort. However, if you look at that yellow wavy line, that's showing us that ATP is being used. Therefore, this is active transport, so letter A cannot be the answer. If we look at the next diagram, it shows two molecules moving in the same direction through some sort of a channel. And the next diagram shows two molecules moving in opposite directions through some sort of a channel. The first is an example of a symporter, and the second is an example of an antiporter. Both of them are examples of facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport because they are using a protein channel to get through the plasma membrane. Therefore, letter B, facilitated transport, is portrayed and is not the correct answer. Letter C, antiporter, is also portrayed in the third diagram and is not the correct answer. Therefore, the answer is letter D, ion channel.
Cheetahs, rainbow trout, and inchworms all belong to the same either order, kingdom, class, or phylum. A cheetah and a rainbow trout would belong to the phylum Chordata, and the inchworm is an invertebrate. Therefore, the highest taxonomic rank that they all belong to is the kingdom Animalia. So B, kingdom, is our answer.
In which part of the heart does oxygenated blood flow out of? So let's think about how the heart is arranged. The right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood, which is going to be pumped to the lungs to get oxygenated again. We can rule out the right side of the heart because we know that's deoxygenated blood flow. So we can rule out letters A and B. Also remember in the heart that the atria, those are the receiving chambers of the heart, and the ventricles are the pumping chambers. Therefore, all the blood is going to be flowing out of the ventricles. So the correct answer in this case is letter C, the left ventricle.